it took so long for us to get there, I'm going to just shut up and start working the pictures.
In the elevator, if you saw the posters there, it said the title was Putin's Special Military Operation. Well, no. I'm expanding it a little bit. We're going to go beyond the battlefield somewhat today. We'll do some of that too. My working title was Ukraine, RIP Pax Americana. So let's go. These are the times that try men's souls, Thomas Paine wrote in the hard winter of 1776. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of his country. Paine, of course, was writing about the American Revolution, but his words apply as well today to the Ukrainian crisis. The war appears to be stalemated. In the past year of this 20-month war, the battle lines have shifted by less than 1/5 of 1% of Ukraine's total territory. Russia grabbed a chunk. Ukraine fought back in the first summer, but things have settled down. There's plenty of war, there are plenty of people dying, but the battle lines don't change much. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky was in Washington this week pleading for continued support for his war effort. Ukraine has liberated half of its newly occupied territories, he said, secured its own maritime grain corridor, Black Sea, is winning in the Black Sea. We require continued U.S. support, as well as the unity of all our allies. But Congress is stalemated too. House Speaker Mike Johnson had what he called a good meeting with Zelensky the other day, during which he told the Ukrainian president that we stand with him and against Putin's brutal invasion, but also that there would be no Ukrainian aid without legislation reforming the U.S. border situation. Everybody's mouth has two sides, right? At least Mike Johnson says. Senator Graham, Lindsey Graham, South Carolina, chimed in, assuring Zelensky. Yeah, somebody's phone. Senator Lindsey Graham chimed in, assuring Zelensky, it's got nothing to do with you. You've done everything anybody could ask of you. Wow, as they say, with friends like these, who needs enemies? And hey, GOP friends, how about this? A possible election twofer. Blame Biden for being soft on the southern border and blame him for losing Ukraine. Win-win. Oh, French day. Calais. In Europe this week, Zelensky did get one big win and one big loss. The win was a big step toward membership in the European Union. It was something of a surprise because Hungary's leader Viktor Orban had expressed opposition. It was quite a pageant. It must have been arranged in some kind of back room. European Union rules require unanimity to accept new members. Orban, radiating outrage or perhaps simulating outrage, left the room. The other EU leaders then voted unanimously to begin the process of bringing in Ukraine and Moldova and eventual EU accession of Georgia and Bosnia-Herzegovina into the European Union family of nations. Did I say one big win and one big loss? Same day, on another issue, continuing aid for Ukraine, Orban got his way. He vetoed the European Union's proposed $54 billion aid package, combined with the Republicans stalling on a U.S. aid package of $61 billion. Zelensky now must figure out how to replace $113 billion worth of aid, and somehow also defeat Russia. So good luck, Mr. President. And University House issues its best wishes for a prosperous and successful new year. On the other side, things are not too hunky-dory for Russia's President Vladimir Putin. Declassified U.S. intelligence this week estimated that Russia has lost nearly 87% of the 360,000-strong army that invaded Ukraine 22 months ago. 87%. That's 315 troops killed or wounded. 315,000 out of a total of 360,000. There may be some double counting. A likely wounded soldier may return to the front. But even with the current stalemate, other sources estimate that 2,000 Russian troops are being killed every month. But Putin manages to send as many to replace them. It's hard to defeat an enemy that has a bottomless well of cannon fodder. The intelligence report also assessed that in terms of personnel and armored vehicles lost, Russia's military has been set back by 18 years. 2/3 of the tanks that spearheaded the invasion 21 months ago have been destroyed, or in some cases, abandoned and captured by Ukrainian forces to turn around against and shoot their former masters. They're pulling out of mothballs Soviet-era tanks from 30 years ago. The intelligence report continues, as of late November, Russia lost over a quarter of its pre-invasion stockpiles of equipment for ground forces. This has reduced the complexity and scale of Russian offensive operations, which have failed to make major gains in Ukraine since early 2022, that is, the first months of the war. Russia has lost at least 20 generals and thousands of officers. Putin can call up all the conscripts he wants, scour the weeds for rusting tanks, and turn up the dial on his nation's miserable industrial capacity, but Russia will spend decades recovering from the losses it has suffered in Ukraine. It may never recover. Russia's capacity to rebuild its army is not even close to its rate of loss. The longer it stays in Ukraine, the weaker Russia becomes. Russians who are paying attention realize that there is no victory in the current path. But alas, these Russians do not have the ear of the Kremlin. Still, give Putin his due. This week he called for peace negotiations. His sincerity as a peace advocate may be judged by a statement he made the other day by the Speaker of the lower house of the Russian parliament, Vyacheslav Volodin. Ukraine must surrender on Moscow's terms or the country will cease to exist. That's peace. That's the peace of the grave. In fact, Putin is more secure in his Kremlin perch than many hoped he would be by this time. Last week, to no one's surprise, he announced he would run for re-election next year, March. He has no incentive to negotiate and every reason to hold tight. If Donald Trump wins next year's election, Putin could reasonably hope to see his dream come true of capturing Kyiv. Trump's associates have said that in a second term he would not only refresh relations with Putin, but pull the U.S. out of NATO. Why should Putin make some compromise deal now when he might win the jackpot in a year's time? One more battlefield report and then we shall shift to the home front. It made news last month when North Korea started shipping ammunition and other war material to Russia. Now it seems that the shells fly erratically, some with longer or shorter ranges. Close examination found variations in the wiring and variances in the amount and quality of gunpowder purchased from North Korea. As the Russian proverb goes, lie down with dogs, get up with fleas. Now on the home front, Russians are facing a large shortage of groceries, accompanied by rising prices. For just one example, women in Belgorod, near the Ukrainian border, are queuing at 5 a.m., hoping for a chance to buy eggs. But the mighty Tsar in the Kremlin has heard them. The day before yesterday, Putin held his annual year-end press conference. This descends from an old Tsarist tradition in which the common people, the peasants, are invited to come and bring their grievances to the dear Tsar, who rules over all of them and cares for all his people. A pensioner complained about the price of eggs. Vladimir Vladimirovich, she pleaded, take pity on the pensioners. We don't get millions in our pensions. Sort this out. We have no one to turn to. And Putin apologized, explained that this was a failure of the government, not of himself, and promised that the situation will be corrected in the near future. One question that was flashed briefly on the TV screen during Putin's levee was, Mr. President, when will the reality in Russia not be different from what is told on television? The question was not answered, and one hopes the questioner has a good excuse. There is more to the egg story. Russia has begun buying eggs from Turkey. Turns out it's cheaper to import eggs from Turkey than it is to produce them in Russia. Item, the Kremlin continues to exist. The Western sanctions have been completely ineffective. Now comes news that 15 in-flight or pre-flight breakdowns of Russian airliners have occurred this month. 15. Grounded air, well, some of them had to make emergency landings. Fortunately, so aborted emergency landings, aborted takeoffs. Fortunately, no crashes and no casualties. But this is the effect of Western sanctions against Russia. There's a shortage of new spare parts, and maintenance suffers as a result. Well, did I say a while back that Russia is losing 2,000 soldiers killed each month? Putin is aware of that fact, and he has a plan. Russian families should have 8 children. No kidding. Here's the quote. Russia is facing the most difficult demographic challenges, and to overcome them, it is necessary to revive the tradition of large families. Speaking at a meeting of the World Russian People's Council this month, he recalled that just a few generations ago, families had 7 or 8 children each, or even more. Let us preserve and revive these wonderful traditions. Having many children and a large family should become a norm, a way of life for all peoples of Russia. Well, Putin in the past has likened himself to the 18th century Russian Tsar Peter the Great. Now it seems he has a new hero, the 13th century Prince Alexander Nevsky, who defeated Swedish invaders from Europe and agreed to pay tribute to the Asiatic Golden Horde, thus saving the Orthodox Church and presaging Russia's distinctiveness from both West and East. Nevsky was canonized as a saint of the Russian Church, Orthodox Church, in 1547. So we see where his inspirations are. It will take a while for 8 baby families to generate enough soldiers for the Ukraine special military operation. So meanwhile, Kremlin is learning from the mercenary impresario Yevgeny Prigozhin. Remember him? The man whose plane mysteriously exploded under him? He canvassed Russian prisons, promising freedom for everyone who fought against Ukraine for 6 months and survived. And Putin is doing that again. You know, more prisoners coming out for the front lines. And there are untapped populations for whom ways may be found to support the Russian military forces. For example, children. This photo shows a boy in Tatarstan using a 3D printer to establish parts of the tail of a mine, which is to be dropped from a drone. The parts are stabilizers that will keep the device from toppling over in the air so that it may hit its target with greater accuracy. Other sources of fighting men for Russia come from Nepal. According to an estimate by Nepal's ambassador to Russia, cited by the Kathmandu Post, 150 to 200 Nepalese citizens are serving in the Russian army as mercenaries. Russian recruiters reportedly offered volunteer soldiers signing bonuses of up to 100,000 rubles, which isn't as much as it sounds like. The special military operation has dramatically weakened the Russian currency. On international markets, 1 ruble is worth about a US penny. So 100,000 rubles is about 100,000 pennies. In fact, just under $1,000. Well, it's still pretty good money for a signing bonus. A recent story on Ukrainian media, so consider the source, told of 6 enterprising young Nepalese who took the money, put on the uniform, were photographed, and then deserted. The Nepalese Foreign Ministry, the Ukrainian source reports that to this day they have not been found. But the Nepalese Foreign Ministry has a, we hope, unrelated story, unrelated to those 6. On the whole, Ukrainian propaganda, this source, the Foreign Ministry asks Russia, please stop recruiting our citizens. 6 of your mercenaries have died, and we demand the return of the bodies and compensation to their families. Well, guess who else is training mercenaries to fight against Ukraine? Yes, the Russian Orthodox Church. This is true. The source is a European security agency again. On the whole, though, Ukrainian propaganda tends to be more truthful or less mendacious than Russian propaganda. Well, you can see what's happening here. We have a Russian priest or prelate, bishop maybe, sprinkling holy water on, are those missiles? Shades of, there was a cardinal who was blessing the bombers in Vietnam many years ago, a U.S. cardinal. The claim is that the Russian Orthodox Church is creating private military groups that it's recruiting in the pay of the Russian Church, not through the government. Just like Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner Group, to recruit and train missionaries for combat against Ukraine, and that at least some of the training happens on church premises. What is not disputed is that Putin has courted the Orthodox Church, and that this special military operation has been blessed by the Church's head, Patriarch Kirill. Still on the home front, since imperial times, through Soviet times, and down to Putin times, Russians know better than to voice discontent. Under a recent law, discrediting the armed forces of Russia carries a large fine and a prison term of up to 5 years. But there is one constituency that Putin's minions know better than to cross: military wives. The word is out from the Kremlin to regional governors: extinguish with money, don't you love that formation? Extinguish with money the protests of the wives of mobilized soldiers, at least up until next March's elections. The cynical explanation is that these wives are often waiting not for their husbands from the war, but from their salary cards. And what about women warriors? From news services, Russian women are being recruited for frontline roles for the first time to serve as snipers and drone operators. The initiative marks a notable departure from the normal Russian practice of using women only in support roles, such as cooks and medical staff. One private military company, for private military company we read mercenary recruiters, is advertising on social media for women to join it for 6-month contracts at a salary from $2,355 per month. That's serious money in Russia, about double the monthly per capita income. Women participate in the Russian military at far lower rates than in comparable armed forces around the world. Only 4% of Russian military personnel are female, and fewer than 1% of officers are women. In contrast, Ukrainian women have long served at the front. Female Russian soldiers, according to an account published by Radio Free Europe, are reportedly subjected to sexual abuse and violence by male soldiers, what else is new, and pressured into becoming the field wives of officers. But this is the season to be jolly. So let's end this catalog on a seasonal note. Dear St. Nicholas, writes a Ukrainian boy, Ruslan Dyomin, this year I wanted to ask for a bicycle, but I thought about it and decided not to. Instead, I am asking you for a superpower for the Ukrainian armed forces. Give all the soldiers 1,000 level armor so that they can come back alive, and the superpower of invisibility so that the enemy does not see them. An endless supply of weapons and ammunition, more food so that they never go hungry, and a warm winter. That's all that is needed this year. Glory to Ukraine. I got to think the kid got a little coaching there. Still, aren't there times when we all might like the superpower of invisibility? But my title for today's talk, as I said earlier, promised more than anecdotes from the front lines. R.I.P. Pax Americana, the end of American global hegemony that has endured since 1945, since the end of World War II. About 20 years ago, Michael Mandelbaum, a professor of American foreign policy, published a book, The Case for Goliath, How America Acts as the World's Government. The United States, Mandelbaum argued, furnishes to other countries the services that their governments provide within the countries they govern. Rules-based order, international security, a global economy, international legitimacy. This role came about, Mandelbaum explained, more or less accidentally. Neither the United States nor any other country sought to establish it. He acknowledges shortcomings in American foreign policy and how other countries came to accept or resent and exert influence on America's global role. And he assessed the prospects for the continuation of this role, which depended most importantly on whether the American public would remain willing to pay for it. Well, friends, as we speak, the Mandelbaum moment seems to have arrived. Perhaps it was foreshadowed by former President Trump pulling out of international agreements and insulting our NATO allies. But mostly, I think, following Mandelbaum, many Americans have tired of the role of Goliath. Is all the misery in the world something that Americans have to set right? Are we the policeman of the world? Are we the social worker of the world? Set aside for the moment the two major wars now raging in Ukraine and Gaza. The 75-year period from 1946 through 2021 saw a steady decline in war deaths. Yes, there was Vietnam, there was Korea, there was the 9-year Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the Balkan Wars of the 90s, and yet averaged out, the absolute number of war deaths has been declining since 1946. In some years of the early post-war era, around 500,000 people died through direct violence in wars. In recent years, the annual death toll tends to be less than 100,000. And now, are we looking at the beginning of an upswing? The Uppsala Conflict Data Program tracks wars globally since 1945. Last year and this, 2022 and 2023, are the most conflictual years since the end of the Cold War in 1991. Ukraine and Gaza are only the most notable. Let's start our tour d'horizon with a look at Russia. In addition to the chunks of the Ukraine that show up on maps every day, Crimea and Donetsk, Luhansk, in addition to them, Moscow has snipped off bits and pieces all around its periphery. Transnistria, on the left in the map there, formerly part of Moldova, is now a nominally independent nation, recognized only by and dependent upon Russia. These two little bits on the right, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, used to be part of Georgia. They were seized by Russia in war several years ago. Down in the Caucasus, Armenia and Azerbaijan have been fighting for years over an enclave called Nagorno-Karabakh. And so it goes around the world. Serbia, Kosovo, Sudan, Ethiopia, Tigray, Syria. At a sub-state level, gangs and cartels menace goats and peasants, including those of Haiti and Mexico. We have not a world war, but a world at war. When was the last time any of us gave the slightest thought to Guyana, that tiny country perched on the shoulder of South America? In the Age of Empire, the area was first colonized by the Dutch, then was transferred to Britain in the 18th century. It gained independence in 1966 and joined the British Commonwealth. It is the only South American country whose official language is English, though most of its citizens speak an English-based Creole. Guyana's cultural ties are to the north with various Caribbean islands, and the headquarters of the Caribbean Community Organization, CARICOM, are in the Guyanese capital, Georgetown. Don't ask me which of the English King Georges that capital is named for, because I don't know. About 200 years ago, Venezuela began claiming a large chunk of British Guyana, based on Spanish land claims from 200 years earlier. An international tribunal ruled against Venezuela in 1899. The Venezuelan government has never accepted the ruling. At this point, though, the conflict is about oil and gas. In 2015, ExxonMobil made a major oil discovery off Guyana's coast. Together with Hess and China's CNOOC oil company, it's been producing oil in Guyana since 2019. The Essequibo region, that's named for the river, currently produces around 400,000 barrels per day, and that figure could top 1 million barrels per day within 3 or 4 years. This has transformed Guyana into the fastest growing economy in the world. Last year, real GDP shot up 62.4%. And we're proud of our 3% growth this year. It's no wonder Venezuela would like to grab a slice of that. 2 weeks ago, on December 1st, 2 weeks ago, yeah, Thursday, I guess, the International Court of Justice reaffirmed that the disputed region has been governed by Guyana for the past 124 years, and that Venezuela shall refrain from any action that would modify or change this. 2 days later, Venezuela staged a vote, asking its citizens to decide whether the government should ignore the international arbitrators or grant Venezuelan citizenship to Essequibo's English-speaking inhabitants and convert more than 2/3 of Guyana's territory into a new Venezuelan state. And guess what? The resolution passed. They voted for it. Guyana, with a population of less than 1 million, Guyana's population numbers about 29 million. What can Guyana do about this? The U.S., of course, has good reason to protect the interests of U.S. oil companies, like ExxonMobil and its investors. It doesn't want Venezuela's state oil company grabbing the 11 million barrels of recoverable oil and gas sitting off Guyana's coast. But how many skirmishes can we manage? Because there are many other skirmishes, civil war in Yemen, or maybe proxy war, managed by the Sunni Muslim Saudi Arabia, backing the Yemeni government against Shiite rebels, backed by Iran. Then in the Red Sea this week, the rebels fired upon and damaged a Norwegian cargo ship. The Houthis say they're forbidding all shipping to Israel, though the ship's manifest listed Italy as its destination. Who will enforce freedom of the seas? More fighting, civil war in Myanmar, Eastern Congo. In Eastern Congo, the government is confronted by rebels backed by neighboring Rwanda. The United States has drawn up a multi-part deal to de-escalate the fighting and has promised to help enforce the deal. What does that mean? Help enforce the deal. Potentially the most dangerous conflict in the world is brewing in the South China Sea. Over the past decade, China has dredged up more than 3,200 acres of land out of the sea and created islands. Chinese sovereign territory, they say. Has 7 occupied outposts in the Spratly Islands. The South China Sea is perhaps the most contested waterway in the world. China, Brunei, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, and Taiwan all have competing interests there. Almost daily, the Philippine government complains about Chinese forces menacing its sailors and its fishermen. Videos, photos, eyewitness accounts document the encounters. In late October, Chinese vessels twice collided with Philippine ships. The Philippines, a former U.S. colony, is our oldest ally in the Indo-Pacific region. The two countries, U.S. and Philippines, have a mutual defense treaty. Potentially, this South Pacific conflict may be more explosive than the U.S.-Chinese standoff over Taiwan. This region, off the coast of Southeast Asia, bounded by the larger islands of the Philippines, Taiwan, Indonesia, they surround a deep basin studded with reefy shoals, yielding rich aquatic life and abundant energy resources. More than half the fishing vessels in the world are believed to operate here, along with some of the world's busiest shipping lanes and some $3 trillion in annual trade. It is a region of overlapping exclusive economic zones as defined by international treaty. Those China's claims are not based on economic rights, but by the claim that in the 1400s, when other colonies lacked seagoing technology, Chinese ships traded this far away from China. Therefore, the South China Sea is historic Chinese waters. China's claim turned up an amusing imbroglio just this year in connection with the global movie sensation Barbie. The controversy erupted when the movie character Barbie is told she must leave Barbie land and enter the real world. In the real world, there's a map that appears for just a split second. It looks like it was drawn by a child who likes bright colors and has failed geography class. But first Vietnam and then China blocked distribution of the movie because this fantasy map was inconsistent with the 9-dash line, which was drawn in the 1940s, that outlines China's formal claim to the South China Sea. Friends, this is what life has come to in our time. A movie about a doll creates a geopolitical firestorm. For the record, in 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague struck down the 9-dash line and ruled that the disputed area was part of the Philippines' exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. Beijing, of course, ignores this rule. There's Barbie, yeah.
Barbie wins.
Beijing, of course, ignores this ruling and continues to harass Philippine shipping and to build and arm artificial islands as a display of Chinese presence. Who will do anything about this? Will the United States? Let's return ever so briefly to Michael Mandelbaum's case for Goliath. He reckoned, this is in 2005, he wrote the book, sooner or later the American people would tire of being the world's tutor and guarantor, and when that happened, he forecast, no country would thank us, and no country would replace us. From now on, shall it be the state of nature, described nearly 400 years ago by Thomas Hobbes? The war of all against all? To alleviate this misery, Hobbes proposed an all-powerful Leviathan to govern and regulate the unruly state of nature. America, it might be said, has been this Leviathan for 75 years. And as Pax Americana ends, shall there be a return to the murderous Hobbesian state of nature? Or let's hope some sort of multipolar order. Can that emerge from diplomacy? Or must we go through more wars as we did in the Napoleonic era, and again the world wars of the 20th century, before we find a new equilibrium? That's too dark. I want to close with some observations from the excellent lecture Monday by Scott Montgomery, a professor of UW's Jackson School of International Studies. A number of you attended this lecture, I know. But I wanted to share some of his insights with the House at large. Professor Montgomery's title was Energy Geopolitics, Impacts of the Ukrainian War. The Ukraine war has upended the global energy market, Professor Montgomery said. He used the example of Europe. In the short period from 2010 to 2021, the European Union's dependence on Russian energy rose from about 17% of European consumption to more than 40%. So it more than doubled in just 11 years. A huge pipeline system was expanded to import oil and gas from Russia. To Americans fretting that Europeans were making themselves hostage to Russian political pressure, the answer, especially from Germany, was that the pipelines created a healthy interdependence benefiting both partners. Then Putin's army moved into Ukraine. Europe faced a stark choice: acquiesce to Putin's aggression or face a winter of unheated homes and hobbled industry. That first summer of 2022, Putin provided a prodding reminder with several interruptions of natural gas delivery, ostensibly for maintenance of the pipeline. Europe made its choice, turning elsewhere for oil and gas. Within a year, its dependence on Russian energy had dropped from over 40% to between 5 and 8%. A providentially mild winter helped Europe get through the season, and the United States came to the rescue with greatly increased deliveries of liquefied natural gas. But now, what was Russia going to do with all the energy products that were no longer flowing westward? China, India, and Turkey partially filled the gap, but there was little pipeline infrastructure in those directions, so the deliveries had to be made more expensively by ship. What is happening, Professor Montgomery said, is a realignment of the world's energy economy into two camps. The democracies, the United States, Europe, Japan, on one side, and on the other, the autocracies, Russia, China, OPEC. Does this mean that a new Cold War is brewing? U.S. companies have kept production high. Supply and demand tends to lower prices. Russia and OPEC have agreed to reduce production in order to support prices. The Ukraine war, Professor Montgomery concluded, has added what he called a security premium to any transition away from fossil fuels. That is, there's more to the equation than just relying on the development of non-carbon energy sources. Governments must also protect access to the energy their people require. In the last days, you will have read the Global Climate Change Conference in Dubai ended with a pledge to phase out fossil fuels. Not eliminate them or replace them, but phase out. No timetable. This was a formulation vague enough to draw the support even of oil companies and oil-exporting countries. The news came out a couple of days after Professor Montgomery's talk, but I doubt it will have impressed him. He concluded his talk with what he called terrible news. At the wrong point in history, he said, meaning just when we should be transitioning away from fossil fuels, we now have more oil and gas than we know what to do with. Shale formations constitute 60% of the Earth's crust. And we now have the technology, fracking, to exploit these resources. The world may be on the cusp of a new energy bonanza, a fossil fuel bonanza. Just as the vision of Pax Americana, of a rules-based world finding a cooperative way forward, seems to be receding. R.I.P. Requiescat in pace. Rest in peace. I invite your questions and comments.
Thank you, Hal. Guess I have a comment or question for Hal and Jerry, and then Charlie.
So, Hal, the Republican objection to the support of Ukraine is sort of, as far as I can see, is based on them trying to get us to deal with the southern border problem in a way that they would find satisfactory. Are there any good arguments as to why we should not be supporting Ukraine?
Well, some of the Republicans are saying there's majority support in both parties up until now for supporting Ukraine, although it seems to be waning in the Republican Party. A number of them are saying simply, we can't afford it. Another argument can be made, it's a lot cheaper to support Ukraine than it is going to be to rearm against a continually aggressive Russia in Europe. But there is the bill that is currently there that they're arguing about actually does have support for the southern border. It's a lot of money, I forget exactly how much, to hire more people so that they can process them faster. But they say that's not enough. They want more than that.
Process them.
The Republicans, yeah. So that's not enough. They want more. In a way, Biden fell into his own trap. He put that support for the southern border to hire more people, he put that in as a sort of a compromise sweetener.
Yeah.
If he had said, let's make this a clean bill about supporting Ukraine, then we could have had an up and down vote. But no, we can't. So.
Well, when Russia invaded Ukraine, many of Russia's modern technocrats and all left Russia. Surely they were writing home after they got out of Russia. They would have had many parents, siblings, cousins, nephews, nieces, that they would be made aware of what their feelings were. What influence would those many people back in Russia have in terms of what they've learned from the people that have left Russia?
Well, you'd think it had some influence, but although there were many people who left, in a country of 140 million, it wasn't all that many. And so they were telling their friends who already kind of agreed with them. What might, in a small way anyway, might have more influence, the Ukrainians allow Russian prisoners to phone home. And so they tell mom what's going on here, you know, and they complain and they whine and, you know, of course. Because the Ukrainians the Ukrainians don't have to coach them in scripts. And now I want you to tell them that we're treating you well. And there are even intercepted phone calls sometimes from Russian soldiers who are in the trenches, talking about, you know, we're terrified that the Ukrainians, they send these drones over all the time, you know, and they drop grenades and little bombs on us. And, you know, it's cold, it's freezing, the food is terrible. Half of our officers are incompetent, and well, there's always griping in an army. I mean, I was in the army, you know. You're going to get bitching from soldiers, you know? But on the other hand, it's all too plausible. So you would think that would have some influence as well. That may also be one reason why in his recruiting, Putin is beating the bushes in the non-Russian areas and sending, various, Tartars and Yakuts and, whoever you can find. He's sending a lot of them. They're off they go. I mean, they're citizens of Russia, even if they're not ethnic Russians. And but that's one way that if they call home, so what? That's a long way away, and it's not important people. Still, there are a lot of them. Most of the army, of course, would consist of Russians. But yeah, communication with the home front would be, I would think, would build up eventually to have some effect.
Anyone else? Many thanks to all the helpers who struggled mightily to get us finally connected, and Al especially for loaning the computer that finally got us.
Save the day. I also want to mention Karen, who was the one who came up with all the photos and illustrations, and well, that was quite a job for her. I didn't have to do anything except say, "Oh yeah, I think I'd like another one like that, please." So thank you.